The bullet came first. Then the silence. Kang Jae-won watched from the shadows as his own men carried his empty coffin through the doors of Seoul's most expensive funeral hall. And not one person inside that room looked sad enough to convince him. Politicians bowed with their phones still in their hands. Executives whispered share prices beside flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Distant relatives who hadn't called him in years now sat in the front row wearing grief like an expensive coat they'd borrowed for the occasion. His cousin Kang Hyun-suk stood near the entrance greeting guests with the kind of smile a man only wears when something he's waited years for has finally arrived. Jae-won watched him from behind a worker's uniform and a plain black mask. His eyes cold and completely still. 3 weeks ago, someone had leaked his most protected shipment route to a rival organization. 4 of his men never came home. Then came the financial sabotage. Then the disappearing documents. Then the staged ambush near Mapo Bridge that was supposed to kill him but instead only confirmed what he already suspected. The traitor wasn't outside his empire. The traitor had been sitting at his table. So Jae-won did what he did best. He thought 3 steps ahead. He staged the explosion himself, fed the story to every major news outlet in Seoul, and watched carefully to see who exhaled first. Hyun-suk exhaled before the ambulances even left the scene. Now Jae-won stood invisible inside his own funeral, patient and precise, cataloging every fake tear and every hungry eye in the room. This was always how he worked. No noise. No wasted movement. Just observation, calculation, and then complete destruction. He had done this his entire life. What he had not planned for was her. Adiza Konkwo stood at the back of the funeral hall for exactly 4 minutes before she moved. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her role as contract house manager for the Kong estate technically ended the moment Jae-won was declared dead. She had no seat assigned, no black dress expensive enough for this crowd, no connection to anyone in that room that society would consider valid. But she came anyway. She walked slowly through the side aisle, past the politicians and the whispering executives, past Hyun-suk's borrowed grief and the relatives already calculating square footage of the estate. She walked until she reached the front of the room where the black coffin sat surrounded by white lilies and expensive silence. And then Adiz, who had survived leaving Lagos at 23 with nothing, who had rebuilt herself in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language for the first 6 months, who had learned to keep every feeling locked behind professional composure, completely fell apart. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and completely, the way people break when nobody is watching and they finally stop pretending. Her hand rested on the side of the coffin. Her shoulders dropped. And tears rolled down her face with the kind of honesty that couldn't be performed. "You never even let anyone take care of you," she whispered. Not once. Behind her, a woman in a designer suit leaned toward her companion. Who is she again? House staff. Nigerian. Can you imagine? Quiet laughter followed. Adiz didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, one hand on the coffin, until she had said everything she needed to say to a man she was never supposed to love and never told. Across the room, Kang Jae-won had stopped moving. He had been watching the cousin. He had been tracking Director Lim's nervous hands and reading the body language of every executive in the room. He had a system. He had a plan. And then his eyes found her and the system stopped working. He knew who she was. He had seen her in the mansion hallways for almost 8 months. Efficient, quiet, invisible in the way good staff learned to be. She ran the household with precision that impressed even his most demanding executives. She never asked for anything. Never complained. Bowed respectfully when he walked past and got back to work before he reached the next corridor. That was all he knew about her. So why was she the only person in a room full of hundreds who was crying like she meant it? Jae-won studied her carefully from behind his mask. There was nothing performative about her grief. No glances toward the cameras. No dabbing of dry eyes. Just a woman completely destroyed beside a coffin, and she didn't even care who saw it. Something shifted in his chest that he didn't have a name for immediately. He filed it away and kept watching. The ceremony dragged on for another hour. Speeches were made by men who mispronounced his mother's name. Politician called him a visionary. Hyun-suk stood at the podium and delivered a eulogy so polished it sounded like it had been written weeks in advance. 'Cause it had been. Ji-won clocked the timing. Clocked the confidence. Clocked the way Hyun-suk's eyes moved to Director Lim twice during the speech for reassurance. Two men synchronized. Two men with a plan already in motion. But he needed them comfortable. Comfortable men made mistakes. As the ceremony finally ended and guests began filing out, Adiz stood slowly and turned to leave. One of the senior household staff stepped directly into her path. The woman's name was Mrs. Park. 22 years with the Kong family. She had made Adiz's first 3 months in that mansion feel like a punishment designed specifically for her. "You embarrassed everyone today," Mrs. Park said quietly, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Adiz met her eyes without flinching. "I said goodbye. That's all. You're contracted staff. You had no business being at the front of that room. Nobody stopped me from walking there." Mrs. Park stepped closer, dropping her voice so the nearby guests wouldn't hear clearly. "Don't mistake his basic decency for something it wasn't. Men like Kong Jae-won don't notice women like you. Not really. Whatever you imagined in that head of yours." "I'm not imagining anything." Adiz's voice stayed completely level. "I respected him. He was decent to me when he had no obligation to be. Came to say goodbye. That's the full story." She stepped around Mrs. Park and walked toward the exit. But as she moved through the thinning crowd, something slipped from inside her sleeve. A folded piece of paper. It hit the floor silently and she was already 3 steps past it before it landed. She didn't notice. Jae-won did. He waited until the hallway cleared. Then he crossed to where the paper had fallen, picked it up without breaking his stride, and slipped into a side corridor. He unfolded it. The handwriting was careful. Neat. Someone who thought about every word before committing it to paper. "Mr. Kong. I know you don't know me properly and that's fine. I only wanted to say some things I never found the right moment to say out loud. Thank you for approving my mother's hospital bills last December without telling anyone. The accounts office denied my request twice. You overruled it during a late-night budget review and I only found out by accident 3 weeks later. You never mentioned it. Not once. Thank you for leaving food on the kitchen counter on the nights you worked past midnight. I know you noticed the portions were being controlled by senior staff. It was easier for you to leave things behind than to make it an issue. That was kind. Thank you for pretending not to see me crying in the East Garden last spring. You walked past twice and both times you found something else to look at. That was the most dignity anyone in that building had ever given me. People say you're dangerous, cold, ruthless. Maybe that's all true. But cold people don't do quiet things for people who can't do anything for them in return. I think you're just someone who got tired of being hurt and built walls high enough that nobody could reach you anymore. I hope you rested before the end. I hope it wasn't painful. Adiz Okonkwo. Jae-won stood completely still in that corridor for a long time. The hospital bills. He remembered signing off on a flagged expense during a meeting that ran until 3 a.m. A name on a spreadsheet. He hadn't even looked at the face attached to it. The food. He had noticed the kitchen politics months ago. Leaving portions behind was the path of least resistance. He had never connected it to her specifically. The garden. He remembered. A figure near the east wall, shoulders shaking. He had been on a call he couldn't interrupt. He looked away because looking felt like an intrusion. She had archived every one of those small moments and turned them into something that felt like. He didn't finish the thought. What he finished instead was the cold calculation that had kept him alive for 36 years. She had been near his private office the night of the financial meeting. She had seen and heard things she probably didn't even realize were dangerous. And if this letter had slipped out of her sleeve in a room full of Hyun-suk's watching eyes. Jae-won folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. Then his phone buzzed. One message from his bodyguard Lee Hyun-woo. Hyun-suk just pulled 2 men from security detail. Sent them somewhere. Not the mansion. Jae-won typed back 2 words. Find her. But before Hyun-woo could move, something else happened inside the funeral hall that changed the timeline completely. Hyun-suk had noticed the paper drop. He had been watching Adiz since she stood at the coffin. And the moment he saw Jae-won's disguised figure moving in the direction where the paper had fallen, something shifted behind his eyes. He didn't know the worker was Jae-won, but he knew that paper existed. And he knew what was written near that office the night everything began unraveling. He walked to his most trusted man and spoke quietly. The woman, the African house manager. Find out where she goes tonight. And bring me whatever she's carrying. Outside the funeral hall, Seoul's rain had turned violent. Adiz walked alone to the staff transit stop 3 blocks away. Coat pulled tight, heels clicking against wet pavement. The city moved around her the way it always did. Fast, indifferent, completely unbothered by one woman's grief. She was almost at the corner when headlights swept slowly beside her. Black car. Tinted windows. Moving at exactly her pace. She stopped walking. The window came down 2 inches. Get in the car. The voice was low. Controlled. Completely familiar. Adiz turned slowly. Even behind the mask and the plain worker's cap, she recognized those eyes. She had spent 8 months studying them from respectful distances across hallways and meeting rooms. Her bag dropped from her shoulder. Her lips parted. That's not possible, she said quietly. I watched them close that coffin. Adiz. His voice carried the same cold authority it always did. Like a man who had never once in his life needed to repeat himself. Get in the car. Right now. Before someone sees your face with mine. She didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her bag, opened the door and got in. The car pulled away from the curb immediately. Smooth. Practiced. The kind of exit that left no trace. Adiz sat rigid in the back seat, staring straight ahead, every professional instinct she had screaming at her to stay composed while her entire chest felt like it was collapsing. He was alive. Kang Jae-won, the man she had quietly grieved for 3 days, whose funeral she had just attended, whose coffin she had just touched with her bare hands, was sitting 18 inches away from her, pulling off a face mask with the casual energy of someone removing sunglasses. She turned to look at him directly. You faked it, she said. Yes. The explosion. The news. The funeral. All of it. Yes. 1 beat of silence. Why are you telling me? Jae-won looked at her for the first time fully, not as a figure in a hallway, not as a name on a budget spreadsheet, but directly. His eyes were the same as always. Dark, unreadable, giving nothing away for free. Because someone in that room wants you dead, he said. And you don't even know it yet. The car disappeared into Seoul's rainy dark, and somewhere behind them, 2 men were already following. If you want to know what Adiz overheard that made her a target, and what Kang Jae-won does when he finds out someone touched what's his, stay with us. This story is just getting started. The safe house was a 4th-floor apartment above a laundry business in Mapo district. No marble floors. No floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. No staff moving silently through corridors with silver trays. Just concrete walls, dim lighting, the smell of detergent rising from the floor below, and a man who controlled half of Seoul's underground trade sitting at a plain wooden table like it was the most natural thing in the world. Adiz stood near the door and didn't take her coat off. Lee Hyun-woo, Jae-won's bodyguard, had checked the perimeter twice since they arrived. He was a large, quiet man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw and eyes that never fully relaxed. He hadn't spoken to her directly since the car. He didn't look like someone who spoke to people directly often. Jae-won sat down, poured himself coffee from a flask on the table, and opened a laptop without looking at her. Sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. He looked up then, just briefly. The kind of look that communicated very clearly that he wasn't asking. Adiz pulled out a chair and sat down. You said someone wants me dead, she said. Explain that. Jae-won turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a still image pulled from security footage. The funeral hall corridor. Hyun-suk leaning close to a man in a gray suit, both of them watching something off camera. 3 weeks before the explosion, Jae-won said, I held a private meeting in my office. 11 at night. 4 people in the room, myself, Director Lim, my CFO, and 1 other executive. We were discussing a significant amount of money that had disappeared from 3 subsidiary accounts over 18 months. Dee said nothing. She was listening with her whole body. You were cleaning the corridor outside that office that night. The memory surfaced immediately. The argument she had tried not to hear. The raised voices that went quiet the moment footsteps approached. She had kept her head down and her cart moving. I wasn't eavesdropping, she said. I know that. I barely heard anything. Hyun-suk doesn't know that. Jae-won closed the laptop. He saw you at the funeral. He saw something fall from your coat. And now he thinks you're a loose end. The word loose end landed in the room and stayed there. Adiz looked at him steadily. What did you hear that night? What was actually said in that meeting? Enough to confirm the money trail leads directly to my cousin and Director Lim. His voice carried no emotion when he said it, like he was reading a weather report. Enough to take both of them apart completely. I just needed time and a reason for them to stop being careful. So you died. So I died. Adiz was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Seoul moved at its usual pace, indifferent and relentless. Rain was still falling. How long do you need me to stay here? She asked. Jae-won looked at her with something that might have been surprise on anyone else's face. On his face it was just a slight stillness. Most people in your position would be asking how they get out of this, he said. I'll ask that too if the answer to my first question is unreasonable. Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. Gone before it fully arrived. A week. Maybe less. I need you visible enough that Hyun-suk thinks you're still a target but not accessible enough for him to reach you. So I'm bait. You're protected bait. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. Jae-won picked up his coffee. You'll have your own room. Hyun-woo is outside every night. Nobody knows this address except 3 people including myself. He paused. You'll be compensated for the inconvenience. Significantly. Adiz looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. I don't want your money, Mr. Kong. He looked at her directly. Then what do you want? I want you to tell me the truth about what's happening. All of it. Not the version you decide I need to hear. The actual truth. She held his gaze without blinking. If my life is already in this, I deserve to understand why. The room was quiet except for the rain and the distant sound of machines running in the laundry below. Jae-won studied her for a long moment, the same way he studied everything. Looking for the angle. Looking for what was being hidden underneath the surface of what was being said. He didn't find one. All right, he said. He talked for 40 minutes. Not everything. Jae-won was not a man who gave everything to anyone. But enough. The financial sabotage that started 2 years ago. The shipment route that got leaked and cost 4 men their lives. The pattern of internal information reaching rival organizations at precisely the moments it could cause maximum damage. The way both Hyun-suk and Director Lim had slowly positioned themselves over 18 months so that if Jae-won disappeared, the transfer of power would look seamless and inevitable. Adiz listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both cutting directly to the part of the story that mattered most. He answered both without deflecting. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Your cousin has been planning this for at least 2 years, she said. Yes. And Director Lim is the money. Hyun-suk is the face. Yes. So destroying one without the other doesn't finish it. Jae-won looked at her with that stillness again. No. It doesn't. Then you need evidence that connects them both simultaneously. Something that can't be dismissed or buried by lawyers. That's what I've been building. How close are you? Close. He picked up the coffee again. The night you were cleaning outside my office, The meeting ran long because Director Lim made a mistake. He referenced a specific account number out loud. An account that doesn't exist in any official Dahan Group records. Jaewon's eyes were flat and focused. That number is the thread that unravels everything. Have the account. Have the transfers. I need one more piece of documentation that ties Hyunsuk's personal authorization to the withdrawals. And you don't have it yet. I will within 4 days. Adiz nodded slowly. She looked down at her hands on the table. Steady hands. He noticed that. All right, she said quietly. 4 days. The first night was the hardest. Not because of the danger. Adiz had grown up in Lagos understanding danger as a background condition of life, something you factored in without letting it become the main character of your day. She wasn't afraid of the situation the way someone who had always been protected might be. The hard part was the proximity. 8 months of respectful distance. 8 months of bowing and stepping aside and making herself invisible in hallways and conference rooms. 8 months of understanding precisely where the boundaries were and staying behind them without being told twice. And now she was 12 feet away from Kang Jae-won in a small apartment with no mansion between them, watching him work in silence at a table in the dim light, sleeves pushed up, completely in his element even here, even like this. She made herself look away and focus on the wall. He noticed most things. That had always been his particular curse and his primary advantage. A mind that catalogued everything and forgot nothing. It had made him one of the most dangerous men in South Korea before he was 30. It had also made ordinary human interaction feel like a series of calculations he was always slightly too aware of. But Adiz was doing something he didn't have a clean category for. She wasn't performing composure. She genuinely had it. There was no nervous energy directed at him, no careful management of his proximity, no angling for something. She was just present, contained, completely herself in a situation that would have unraveled most people. He found it oddly difficult to stop noticing. Around midnight, she heated water from the small kitchen and made tea without asking if he wanted any. She placed a cup beside his laptop without interrupting what he was reading and moved back to the couch. He looked at the cup, then at her. She was already reading something on her phone, legs folded beneath her, completely unbothered. He drank the tea. 3 days passed. They developed a rhythm without discussing it. Jaewon worked through the nights. Adiz slept in the second room and woke early, moving through the small apartment quietly, never in his way, never absent when something needed doing. She reorganized the documents he left scattered across the table into a system that made sense. He didn't comment on it. He also didn't undo it. On the second day, Hyun-woo reported that 2 men had visited the mansion asking for Adiz under the pretense of settling her contract termination. They were not HR representatives. Jae-won received the information, made 1 call, and the 2 men were redirected in a manner that wouldn't require a second visit. Adiz didn't ask for details. She said, "Thank you," simply and directly, and went back to what she was doing. That was the moment something changed in how Jae-won looked at her, though his expression didn't shift visibly enough for anyone to read it. On the 3rd night, he came back to the apartment later than usual. There was a cut along his left forearm, shallow but recent, wrapped with a bandage that hadn't been done carefully enough. Adiz looked at it once, stood up, went to the small first aid kit on the bathroom shelf without being asked. "Sit down," she said, returning to the table. "It's fine. The bandage is coming loose on the left side and you wrapped it too tight on the right. Sit down." He looked at her. She looked back. He sat down. She rewrapped it efficiently. No hovering. No unnecessary contact. Hands steady, pace clinical, done in under 2 minutes. She tied it off and stepped back. "Don't let it get wet tonight," she said. Jae-won looked at the bandage. Then at her. "Where did you learn that?" "I have 3 younger brothers." She put the kit away. "Someone was always bleeding." He watched her cross back to the couch. She picked up her phone again like nothing had happened. "Adiz." She looked up. "The account your mother used for her surgery last year," he said. "It's still active." If she needs anything else. She's fine. Adi's voice was quiet but firm. She recovered well. Thank you for that. You didn't have to do it and you did. That's enough. I'm saying if she needs anything in the future. Mr. Kong. She met his eyes directly. I'm not going to become someone who takes things from you. That's not who I am. The room held that statement for a moment. Jaewon said nothing. But something in the set of his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. He went back to work. On the fourth morning, Adiz was standing at the small window watching rain hit the street below when her phone rang. An unknown Nigerian number. She answered immediately. 3 seconds of silence. Then a man's voice speaking Igbo. Her face changed completely. Jaewon looked up from across the room. The call lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Adiz lowered the phone slowly. Her knuckles were white around it. What happened? Jaewon said. Not a question. She looked at him. For the first time since the funeral, the composure was cracking at the edges. My mother, she said. 2 men came to her house in Enugu this morning. They told her I stole something from the Kong estate before Mr. Kong died, and that I need to come forward or there will be consequences. Her voice was completely steady but her hands weren't. They knew her full name, her address, the name of the street she grew up on. The temperature in the room dropped. Not because of anything visible. Jaewon didn't raise his voice. His expression didn't change dramatically. But something happened in his eyes that made the air feel different. He picked up his phone. Hyunwoo. 1 sentence in Korean. Then he ended the call. It'll be handled, he said. Adiz stared at him. How? Within the hour. Jaewon. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. She didn't seem to notice. Those are real people. My mother is 61 years old and she lives alone. I need to know she's actually. I have 2 men already in Lagos on a separate matter. His voice was completely level. They'll be at her house before your cousin finishes his lunch. Nobody will go near her again. Adiz looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something to doubt. She didn't find it. Why? She asked quietly. Jaewon held her gaze. Because Hyunsuk used her to get to you. That's not something I leave unaddressed. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. 53 minutes later, Hyunwoo confirmed both men had been removed from the situation permanently. Adiz's mother called back 20 minutes after that, confused but safe, reporting that 2 very serious young men had appeared at her gate and politely but firmly explained that she was under no legal threat and that no one would be bothering her again. Adiz hung up the call and sat very still at the table. Jaewon was across the room with his back to her, studying a document on his laptop. Thank you, she said. He didn't turn around. Don't thank me. I'm going to thank you anyway. Go to sleep, Adiz. She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived and went to her room. Jaewon sat alone in the dim light for a long time afterward, staring at a document he had stopped reading 20 minutes ago. He was in trouble. He knew exactly what kind. He had spent 36 years making sure this specific kind of trouble never found him. And then his phone buzzed. Hyunwoo again. 1 message. Someone photographed her entering this building 2 nights ago. Image is already moving through Hyunsuk's network. He knows she's still in Seoul. He's sending 3 men tonight. Jaewon closed the laptop. He stood up slowly, rolled his sleeves down, picked up his jacket. Then he knocked twice on Adiz's door. Get up, he said quietly through the door. And stay close to me tonight. Things are about to get complicated. From inside the room, after a brief silence, her voice came back calm and even. How complicated? Jaewon picked up the firearm from the side table and checked it with practiced efficiency. The kind you don't ask questions about until it's over. Then the sound of her standing up. The 3 men arrived at 11:47 p.m. Jaewon knew they were coming before they reached the 2nd floor. Hyunwoo had eyes on the building entrance and sent the confirmation the moment the car parked. 3 men. armed, moving with the specific kind of casual confidence that meant they weren't expecting resistance. That was their first mistake. Jae-won had already moved Adiz to the back room and repositioned everything in the main space in the 7 minutes between Hyun-woo's message and their arrival. Table against the far wall. Lights adjusted. Sight lines calculated. He had done this so many times in so many rooms that his body handled the logistics while his mind stayed completely still. Adiz sat on the floor of the back room with her back against the wall, knees pulled up, phone face down in her lap. No light. No sound. He had told her one thing before closing the door. Don't move until I open that door myself. Not Hyun-woo. Me. She had looked at him with those steady eyes and nodded once. No panic. No dramatics. Just compliance delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the difference between trust and submission. He closed the door. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something Adiz saw. She heard it. 3 distinct sounds of impact. A crash that shook the wall briefly. 2 voices cut short in rapid succession. A longer silence that somehow felt louder than the noise that preceded it. Then footsteps, measured and hurried, moving toward her door. 2 knocks. She exhaled. The door opened and Jae-won stood in the frame, jacket still on, expression completely unchanged, like he had just returned from checking the mail. There was a small cut above his right eyebrow. He didn't appear to have noticed it. Adiz stood up slowly and looked past him into the main room. 2 of the men were restrained. The third was sitting against the far wall holding his arm at an angle that suggested it was no longer functioning correctly. Hyun-woo stood near the entrance with the door secured. She looked back at Jae-won. Is it over? She asked. For tonight. She nodded. Then she crossed the room to the kitchen counter, ran a cloth under cold water, came back, and held it out toward the cut above his eyebrow without saying anything. Jae-won looked at the cloth, then at her. I'm fine. You have blood running toward your eye. Take the cloth. He took it. Held it to his forehead without breaking eye contact. You're remarkably calm, he said. Would panic have helped anything? No. Then what would be the point? She turned back toward the kitchen. I'm making tea. Sit down before you decide you're fine and fall over. From across the room, Hyun-woo very carefully looked at the wall. An hour later the 3 men had been removed. Jae-won didn't explain where they went and Adiz didn't ask. Some information was better understood as an outline than a full picture. They sat at the table with tea between them and the city dark and wet outside the window. Adiz turned her cup slowly with both hands. He's escalating. Yes. Which means he's nervous. It means he found something. Jae-won leaned back in his chair. Or he thinks you have something. Either way, sending 3 men to a location he only just identified is reactive. Hyun-suk doesn't do reactive unless something has rattled him. The note, Adiz said quietly. Jae-won looked at her. He saw it fall at the funeral, she said. I didn't realize it had dropped until later. But he was watching me. If he knew it existed and then it disappeared. She stopped. He thinks you left something with me. Something deliberate. Jae-won was quiet for a moment. That's exactly what he thinks. But you didn't. No. Adiz looked at the table. So I'm not just a witness he wants silenced. He thinks I'm carrying proof. Yes. And the longer I stay missing, the more convinced he becomes that the proof is real. Yes. She looked up. That's actually useful to you, isn't it? It wasn't quite a question. Jae-won held her gaze and said nothing, which was itself an answer. Adiz sat with that for a moment. You could have told me that from the beginning. I could have. But you didn't. No. Why? Jae-won set his cup down. When he spoke his voice was the same as always. Level, unhurried, revealing nothing it didn't choose to reveal. Because the safest version of the situation is one where you behave exactly as you would if you knew nothing. People who know they're being used as leverage carry it differently. Hyun-suk would have seen it. Adiz studied him for a long moment. The kind of look that didn't flinch and didn't soften. So you managed me, she said. I protected you. You did both. Silence. Yes, he said finally. I did both. She appreciated that. The honesty of it. A smaller man would have argued the point or dressed it up in something more palatable. One just confirmed it and waited. All right, she said. He looked at her carefully. That's it. You kept me safe. You sent people to protect my mother. You've been honest with me every time I pushed for it. She lifted her cup. I'm not happy about being managed. But I understand why you did it. Those things can both be true. Jae-won looked at her with that particular stillness he got when something didn't fit the pattern he expected. Most people would be angrier, he said. Most people haven't learned that anger without strategy is just noise. She took a sip of tea. I'll be angry later. Right now I want to know what happens next. What happened next arrived the following morning in the form of Adiz remembering something she hadn't realized was important. She had been awake since before sunrise, sitting with coffee at the window, letting her mind move back through the night of the meeting outside Jae-won's office. She had done this before, in the days after first overhearing the argument, turning the memory over like an object she couldn't identify. But now she had context. Financial thread. And suddenly the memory had edges it hadn't had before. Jae-won came out of the back room at 6, already dressed, already focused. There were two voices arguing, she said before he reached the table. That night outside your office. I told you that. He stopped. Yes. But there was a third person. He went very still. I didn't see them. I just heard a door. Your office has a connecting door on the north side of the room. It leads to the archive corridor. I heard it open and close quietly after the argument got loud. Like someone stepped out to make a call or wait somewhere they wouldn't be seen. You're certain? I've been going over it since 4 this morning. I'm certain. Juan sat down slowly. His mind was already moving. The archive corridor connects directly to the east stairwell, which bypasses every internal camera on that floor. Yes. Someone knew to use that route. Someone who had been in that office enough times to know the camera blind spots. Jiwon's jaw tightened. Director Lim has used that corridor before. I've seen him. I never questioned it because he has legitimate reason to access the archives. He paused. But if he used it that night to contact someone externally while Hyun-suk ran the meeting, then whatever they discussed in that room, Adiz said carefully, someone outside the room also heard. In real time. The implications settled between them. Third person. Not just Hyun-suk and Director Lim. Someone else with access, with knowledge of the building's blind spots, with enough standing to be on the receiving end of a live call from Director Lim during a private financial crisis meeting. Jiwon pulled out his phone and called Hyun-woo immediately. Short, direct in Korean. He ended the call and looked at Adiz. Can you remember anything else? Any sound from that corridor? A step, voice, anything. She closed her eyes briefly, played the memory forward slowly. Cufflinks, she said. He waited. When the archive door opened the second time, when whoever it was came back in, I was moving my cart past the far end of the corridor. I didn't look directly, but the light from the office caught something metal. Sleeve level. She opened her eyes. Silver. Pattern. Like scales or a dragon, Jae-won said quietly. Adiz looked at him. His expression had changed. Not broken open. Jae-won's face didn't do that. But something behind his eyes shifted in a way that looked like the specific pain of a wound reopening. You know whose they are, she said. Director Lim wears plain gold. Hyun-suk doesn't wear cufflinks at all. He was quiet for a moment. There is one person in Dahan Group who wears silver cufflinks with a dragon relief. Has worn them every day for 20 years. He worked with my father before I was old enough to understand what the company was. Dee said nothing. She let him have the silence. His name is Chairman Wu, Jae-won said finally. He sits on the board as a non-executive advisor. Technically he has no operational power. But he has relationships with every major financial institution connected to Dahan Group. His voice stayed controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Something old and heavy. He introduced my father to the trade networks that built this empire. When my father died, Wu was the one who told me I was ready to lead. He mentored you. He positioned himself to stay relevant through me. The distinction was exact, and it cost him something to make it. Adiz could see that. "I'm sorry," she said. Jae-won looked at her. A man who had been betrayed before, many times by people worth less. But this one was different, and his eyes said so without his mouth having to. "Don't be," he said. "It confirms the full chain." Hyun-suk needed a financial architect to move the money cleanly. Director Lim provided the mechanism. But neither of them had the institutional relationships to cover the transfers internationally without someone like Wu. He stood up. "This is the piece I was missing." "Then you have everything." "Almost." He picked up his phone again. "I need 48 hours. To do what?" "To make sure when this ends, it ends completely. Not a wound they can recover from. Not something that gets buried in legal proceedings for 6 years. His voice was quiet, but there was iron running through every word. "When I walk back into that boardroom, all three of them lose everything simultaneously. Publicly. Irreversibly." Adiz looked at him for a long moment. At the controlled fury that he wore like a second skin. At the exhaustion underneath it that he probably didn't know showed when he spoke about his father. "You've been carrying this alone for a long time," she said. He looked at her. The company. The decisions. The weight of all of it. She wasn't pitying him. Her voice held none of that softness people used when they wanted something in return for their sympathy. She was just observing directly the way she did everything. "You built walls high enough that nobody could reach you. But walls keep things out in both directions." Jae-won said nothing. "I'm not saying it was wrong," she continued. "Given what surrounded you, it probably kept you alive. I'm just saying it looks exhausting from the outside." The room was very quiet. "It is," he said. It was the simplest thing he had said since the car outside the funeral hall. 2 words. No performance around them. Just a man briefly putting something heavy down. Dees nodded once. "Then finish this. And after it's finished, put it down properly." She stood up, took her cup to the kitchen, and began moving around the small space with her usual efficiency. Like the conversation had happened and been filed, and now the day needed to continue. Jae-won watched her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The 48 hours that followed moved like the quiet before a controlled demolition. Hyun-woo worked through the night pulling financial threads with the team Jae-won had embedded inside Dahan Group's accounting structure months earlier. Documents surfaced. Transfer records materialized. A chain of authorization signatures connected Chairman Wu directly to 7 international accounts used to route the stolen funds. Jae-won reviewed everything with surgical precision. Built the case layer by layer. Every document cross-referenced. Every signature verified. Every financial thread traced back to its source and forward to its destination. He slept 3 hours in 2 days. Dees noticed. She didn't comment on it directly. She just ensured coffee appeared regularly and that meals happened even when he hadn't asked for them. On the second night, she fell asleep on the couch while reading. A document Jae-won had asked her to review still open on the tablet in her hand. He came out of the back room at 2 a.m. and found her there. He removed the tablet carefully without waking her. Set it on the table. He stood there for a moment longer than the task required. Then he took the blanket from the back of the couch and laid it over her with the same efficiency he applied to everything. No gentleness performed for an audience. Just a quiet practical action in an empty room. He went back to work. The morning the evidence package was complete, Jae-won came out of the back room and placed a single folder on the table in front of Adiz. "It's done," he said. She looked at the folder. Then at him. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "All 3 of them?" she asked. "All 3. What happens now?" There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow. Every major shareholder and executive will be present. He sat down across from her. I walk in. Evidence speaks. And they lose everything in front of the people they spent 2 years trying to impress. Adiz nodded slowly. Are you ready? Jae-won looked at her with an expression that was as close to unguarded as she had ever seen on him. Not soft. Not open in any way that left him exposed. Just honest. The work is ready, he said. That's not what I asked. No, he said. It's not. She held his gaze. What's the difference between being ready and the work being ready? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured and low. The work is about the company. About what was stolen and who did it, and making sure it can never happen again. He looked at the folder. But walking back in there means accepting that the man who told me I was ready to lead at 24 was building his position the entire time. That the foundation I thought I inherited was already being hollowed out before I touched it. And accepting that changes something. It means I built everything on top of a lie I didn't know was there. Adiz was quiet for a moment. No, she said then. It means someone put a lie underneath what you built. What you built is still yours. The foundation being compromised doesn't erase the structure above it. You pause. You found the rot. You removed it. That's not failure. That's the opposite. Jae-won looked at her for a long time. Nobody had ever reframed his history and made it feel like ground instead of a wound. He didn't have language for what that did to him. He wasn't sure he needed it. He picked up the folder. Get some sleep, he said quietly. Tomorrow is going to be loud. He was almost at the door of the back room when she spoke. Jae-won. He stopped, turned slightly. Come back in one piece, she said. Not a plea. Not fear. Just a statement delivered with the steady directness that was entirely and completely her. He looked at her across the room for one moment. I always do, he said. And then the door closed between them and the city outside ran dark and wet toward morning. But what neither of them knew was that Hyunsuk had already received word from inside the building. Someone had talked. Not about the evidence. Not about the full plan. Just 2 words, sent from a number registered to a name that would later prove impossible to trace. He's alive. Hyunsuk read the message 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person who had the most to lose if Kang Jae-won walked back through those boardroom doors. Chairman Woo answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Hyunsuk stood at the window of Jae-won's old office, looking out at the same city his cousin had looked at for years, and made a decision that would force the endgame to happen 12 hours earlier than anyone had planned. The call came at 4 a.m. Jae-won's phone. 1 ring. A number he recognized immediately as the private line of Dahan Group's head of legal, a woman named Attorney Shin who had served the company for 15 years and owed Jae-won's father a debt that predated her entire career. He answered. She spoke for 90 seconds without pause. Her voice was low and controlled, but underneath it was something he rarely heard from her. Fear. When she finished, Jae-won sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then he stood up, crossed to Adiz's door and knocked twice. Get up. We're moving now. The door opened within seconds. Adiz was already dressed. He noticed that. Filed it away without comment. What happened, she said. Hyunsuk called an emergency shareholders meeting for 7 this morning. 4 hours from now. Jae-won was already moving through the main room, gathering documents with precise efficiency. He's filing a formal motion to have the board ratify his position as acting chairman before the market opens. If it passes, he controls every legal mechanism inside Dahan Group by business hours. Adiz understood immediately. Which means any evidence you present after that point gets filtered through structures he controls. Lawyers he appointed. Compliance officers who report to Director Lim. A board that will be looking for reasons to validate the transition they already accepted. He picked up the evidence folder. The window is 4 hours. Can you get there in time? I was always going to walk in there. The timeline just moved. He looked at her directly. I need you somewhere safe while this happens. Hyun-woo will take you to. No. Jae-won stop. Adiz stood in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides and her chin level. I heard part of that meeting. Can confirm the voices. I'm a witness, and if your lawyers need a living person to stand behind the documentation, I'm it. This isn't a courtroom. It's a boardroom full of people who've been protecting their own interests for 20 years. Then they need to see that you didn't come back alone. She held his gaze without flinching. You said the work is ready. So is the witness. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. The calculation in his eyes was visible. Weighing risk against utility. Weighing her safety against the strategic value of her presence. If this goes wrong, he said, you are the first person Hyun-woo moves. No argument. Agreed. And you say nothing unless I indicate directly that you should speak. Understood. He looked at her one more moment. Then he picked up his jacket and moved toward the door. Stay close, he said. They arrived at Dahan Group headquarters at 6:41 a.m. The building was a 40-floor tower of glass and steel in Uido, Seoul's financial district, the kind of structure designed to make everyone who approached it feel appropriately small. Dawn was barely breaking across the Han River. The streets were still mostly empty. The lobby security team saw Jae-won step out of the car, and for a full 3 seconds nobody moved. Then the head of lobby security, a man named Officer Bae who had worked that desk for 11 years, straightened immediately and said in a voice that carried across the entire lobby, Chairman Kong. Not acting chairman. Not the late chairman. Chairman Kong. The 2 junior security staff beside him followed without hesitation. Jae-won walked through the lobby without slowing. Adiz stayed half a step behind him and watched the elevator banks ahead without looking at anyone directly. Hyun-woo moved on Jae-won's left. They didn't stop at reception. Didn't sign in. Didn't take the standard executive elevator. Jae-won walked to the private chairman's lift at the far end of the lobby, pressed his palm to the biometric panel, and waited. The panel turned green. Hyun-suk had not thought to revoke the biometric access. That had been his second mistake. The boardroom was on the 38th floor. When the elevator doors opened, the corridor was already full of people. Executives moving quickly, assistants carrying documents, legal staff speaking urgently into phones. The emergency meeting energy was visible from 20 meters away. The first person to see Jae-won was a junior executive named Park who had joined the company 8 months ago and had never been in the same room as the chairman before. He stopped walking mid-stride. His folder hit the floor. The sound made 3 other people turn. And then the corridor did something corridors rarely do. It went completely silent. Not gradually. Instantly. Like a switch. Jae-won walked through the silence without adjusting his pace. His expression was the same as it always was. Flat, focused, giving nothing away for free. He was wearing a dark suit that Hyun-woo had sourced the previous evening. He looked exactly like what he was. The man who owned this building walking through it. Adiz kept pace beside him and looked straight ahead. The boardroom doors were closed. 2 security men stood outside. Men that Hyun-suk had personally reassigned to this floor. They saw Jae-won coming and looked at each other. He didn't slow down. Open the door, he said quietly. They opened the door. The boardroom held 22 people. Shareholders. Senior executives. 3 members of the legal team. Director Lim at the far end of the table. Chairman Woo seated to the right with a particular stillness of a man who had already decided how events were going to proceed. And Hyun-suk at the head of the table. In Jae-won's chair. The room was mid-conversation when the door opened. The conversations died one by one as people registered what they were seeing, like a sound system being switched off section by section until the whole room was nothing but silence and the particular tension of 22 people recalculating simultaneously. Hyun-suk looked up. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that the man beside him physically leaned away. Jae-won walked to the center of the room and stopped. He didn't take the head of the table. Didn't need to. The room had already reoriented itself around him the moment he entered. You're in my chair, Hyun-suk, he said. His voice was completely level, almost conversational. That was always the most dangerous version of him, and everyone in that room who knew him understood that immediately. Hyun-suk didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then something happened in his expression. The shock compressed itself into something harder and more calculated. His eyes moved to the security men at the door, then to Director Lim, then to Chairman Woo. Woo's face was completely unreadable. J1, Hyun-suk said carefully, recovering his composure with visible effort. Nobody is more relieved than I am that you're alive. We all thought. Sit somewhere else. The instruction was delivered with the same tone a person might use to redirect traffic. Quiet. Absolute. Non-negotiable. Hyun-suk stood slowly and moved 1 seat to the left. Performing calm. Performing the reasonable man, making space for a returning family member. Ji-won sat down. He placed the evidence folder on the table in front of him. He didn't open it yet. Before the motion on the floor proceeds, he said, addressing the room without raising his voice, I want to show this board something. He opened the folder. What followed was not a speech. Ji-won didn't do speeches. He didn't perform outrage or construct a narrative designed to manipulate the room emotionally. He simply presented evidence the way a surgeon presents a scan. This is what exists, this is what it means, and this is what needs to happen as a result. The documents went around the table. Bank transfer records, authorization signatures, international account registrations, a timeline of financial extractions mapped against Dahan Group's internal loss records, communications between Hyun-suk and Director Lim spanning 19 months. And at the end of the sequence, 3 items that connected Chairman Woo directly to the mechanism. His signature on 2 international transfer approvals, a communication thread between himself and a financial intermediary in Singapore, and a transfer of personal assets timed precisely to coincide with the largest single extraction from Dahan Group's subsidiary accounts. The room read in silence. Director Lim's hands stopped moving on the table in front of him. Chairman Woo's expression didn't change. But his stillness became a different kind of stillness. The kind that meant the calculation was running at full speed behind a face that had learned over decades to reveal nothing. Hyun-suk was the one who broke first. This is fabricated. His voice was too loud for the room. He disappeared for 2 weeks and came back with documents that could have been created by. The transfers are verified against 3 independent banking institutions, Jae-won said without looking at him. 2 in Seoul. 1 in Singapore. The authentication timestamps predate my death by between 4 and 19 months. Every signature has been cross-referenced against notarized originals held by Attorney Shin, who is currently in this building and available to confirm. Hyun-suk looked at the door. Attorney Shin stepped in from the corridor. She had been there for 4 minutes. Hyun-suk looked back at the table. His composure was fracturing now in real time, the way expensive things fracture. Not all at once, but in spreading lines that made the whole structure suddenly visible as something that could never hold. You manipulated evidence, he said. You staged your own death, disappeared, and built a case designed to. 4 men died in that ambush near Mapo Bridge, Jae-won said. The room went still again. You leaked the shipment route. His voice didn't rise. Drop. Quieter was always more dangerous. 4 of my people went into that situation because someone in this organization sold the information to a rival group. They didn't come back. He looked at Hyun-suk directly for the first time. Not with anger. With something far colder. I have that documentation as well. Hyun-suk said nothing. Director Lim. Ji-won shifted his attention smoothly. Your resignation will be processed before the close of business today. Your personal assets are already under review by the Financial Crimes Unit of the Prosecutor's Office. The contact there is someone I've worked with for 6 years. He answers his phone. Director Lim looked at the table. Then Jae-won turned to Chairman Woo. The older man met his gaze. Still composed. Still performing the dignity of a man who had not yet accepted that the performance was over. I have nothing to say to this board, Woo said carefully. My lawyers. Your lawyers already have the documentation package, Jae-won said. They received it 17 minutes ago. I suspect they have quite a lot to say to you privately. He held the older man's gaze for one long moment. You told me I was ready to lead at 24. You sat across from me at my father's funeral and told me the company was in good hands. I believed you. Woo said nothing. That's the last time, Jae-won said quietly. He looked back at the rest of the room. 22 people who had just watched 3 of the most powerful men in the organization become rubble in under 12 minutes. The motion on the floor is withdrawn, he said. The board will reconvene in 72 hours for a full governance review. Anyone in this room who had knowledge of these activities and chose not to report them should use the next 72 hours to speak with their own legal counsel. He closed the folder. That's all. Outside the boardroom in the corridor, it was Adiz who spoke first. You didn't raise your voice once, she said. Jae-won looked at her. In there. The whole time. She studied his face carefully. Most people, when they've been waiting that long to say something, they can't help performing it. You just said it. He was quiet for a moment. Anger is noise. Noise gives people something to push against. What you did gave them nothing to push against. That was the point. She nodded slowly. Hyun-woo was already moving ahead of them toward the elevator, speaking quietly into his earpiece, managing the 12 things that needed managing simultaneously in the aftermath of what had just happened. Jae-won and Adiz walked the corridor alone for a moment. What happens to them, she asked. Lim and Woo face prosecution. The evidence is too clean to bury. He kept his eyes forward. Hyun-suk will try to negotiate. His lawyers will build a cooperation case against the other 2 in exchange for a reduced outcome. And the 4 men who died. Their families are already provided for. Have been since it happened. His voice was even, but there was weight behind it. That doesn't make it right. It just means they're not also left with nothing. Adiz said nothing for a moment. You've been carrying that too, she said. Yes. For how long? Since the night it happened. She looked at him as they walked. Not with pity. Not with the soft-eyed sympathy that would have made him close off immediately. Just with the same direct attention she gave everything. Seeing him clearly and not looking away from what she saw. Put it down now, she said. He looked at her. Not the responsibility. Not the memory of them. Just the weight of carrying it alone. She held his gaze. You don't have to do that anymore. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The city rose 38 floors below them, gray and vast and beginning to move with morning traffic. Neither of them spoke for the first few seconds. Then Jae-won said without looking at her. After this is settled, I want to take you somewhere. Adiz turned slightly. Where? Somewhere that isn't a safe house or a boardroom or a mansion with 40 employees and no honest conversation. She was quiet for a moment. Is that you asking? She said. Yes. You said you don't ask. I said that once. I'm revising it. Something moved across her face. Real. All right, she said quietly. 3 weeks later, Dahan Group looked like a different company. Not cosmetically. Not in the way organizations performed reform for press cycles without touching anything structural. The changes Jae-won made went into the foundation. New compliance architecture. Independent financial oversight. An internal reporting mechanism that routed directly to the board rather than through the executive layer. 3 departments restructured from the ground up. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It involved difficult conversations and resistant people and days where the weight of what needed changing felt larger than the energy available to change it. Adiz knew because she saw all of it. Her contract had formally ended the week after the boardroom. Jae-won had ensured every term was honored, every outstanding payment settled, and her return to Lagos fully arranged. The car had been booked. The flight confirmed. She had stood in the entrance of the Kong estate on a Wednesday morning with her luggage beside her and her coat on, completely ready to go. He had walked into the entrance hall from the direction of his office, stopped when he saw her bags, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not cold. Not calculating. Not the controlled blankness he wore like armor. Just a man who had run out of ways to be prepared for something. "Your contract is complete," he said. "Yes. You're free to go." "I know." He looked at her bags. Then at her. "Lagos. My mother is there. My brothers." She held his gaze. "My life is there." He nodded slowly. Like a man accepting terms he didn't like but respected. Then she said, "Is there a reason I shouldn't go?" The entrance hall was very quiet. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had cried honestly at his funeral when everyone else calculated inheritance. Who had negotiated in a safe house instead of begging. Who rewrapped a wound without making it sentimental. Who told him to put the weight down and meant it. Who had never once asked him for anything except the truth. "Yes," he said. "Tell me." He crossed the entrance hall slowly. Stopped in front of her. Close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. "I don't want you to go," he said. Simply. Completely. Like a man who had finally stopped dressing things up in strategy. Adiz looked at him. "That's the first thing you've said to me that has nothing calculated behind it." "I know. How does it feel?" "Terrible," he said. "And necessary." She almost smiled. "Almost. You could have just said that 3 weeks ago." "I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. At the exhaustion he no longer bothered hiding. At the walls that were still there but had developed something he probably hadn't planned for. Doors. "My mother would like to meet you," she said quietly. Something shifted in his eyes. Immediate and unguarded. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It's a start," she said. "Which for us is the same thing." They went to the Han River that evening. Not for any reason that could be explained strategically. Jae-won simply drove there after everything was finished, and Adiz didn't ask why. Some places carry weight that needs to be acknowledged in person. The same river where his staged death had begun. They stood at the railing while Seoul's lights reflected across the water in long broken lines. The city moved behind them and around them and paid them no attention at all, the way cities do. Adiz stood beside him with her coat pulled close and her eyes on the water. He stood close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't move away. Neither did she. "It's strange," she said quietly. "Standing here. Yes. This is where it ended. And where it started." He paused. "Both at the same time." He looked at the water. "The night of the explosion, I stood at this railing for about 10 minutes before the car went up. Alone. I was thinking about the 4 men. Whether the plan was worth what it would cost." His voice was low and even. "I didn't think about anyone else. There was no one else to think about." Adiz turned to look at him. "And now," she said. He looked at her. The city light caught his face at an angle that made him look, for just a moment, like a man who had put something very heavy down and wasn't sure yet what his hands were supposed to do without the weight. "And now there is," he said. She held his gaze. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically. Not with the performance of a moment that knew it was a moment. Just her hand finding his at the railing, warm and steady, the way she did everything. His fingers closed around hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some things communicate more completely in silence than any sentence could carry. They stood there while the river moved beneath the lights and the city exhaled around them. 2 people who had found each other inside the wreckage of betrayal and come out the other side holding something neither of them had planned for. Something real. After a long while she turned her face toward him. He was already looking at her. And when he kissed her, it was nothing like the cold precision he brought to everything else in his life. It was careful and unhurried and completely honest. The kiss of a man who had finally stopped calculating the risk of wanting something and simply wanted it. Adiz's free hand found the lapel of his coat. The city lights blurred softly around them. The river kept moving. And somewhere in the distance, Seoul carried on the way it always did. Loud and vast and indifferent. While on a bridge above the Han River, A man who had once faked his own death to survive finally understood what it meant to actually be alive. Some people survive by building walls high enough that nothing can reach them. But every once in a while, someone comes along who doesn't try to climb the wall. They just stand quietly on the other side until the man inside remembers that walls were never meant to be permanent. Kang Jae-won survived because he was ruthless enough to outthink everyone around him. But Adi Zakonkwo was the reason he finally had something worth surviving for. If you stayed until the end of this story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more Afro-Korean stories built different, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We drop new stories every week and you don't want to miss what's coming next.